Thank you so much for joining us here tonight, Tom. Towards the end of your book, you say that you were prompted to write it by your daughter asking you if bringing kids into the world was the right thing to do, given the ecological challenges that we face. And I'm wondering if you think doomerism has become a bigger problem than denialism.
So let me say that of all the members of my family that are here, my daughter's not one of them, so I feel free to say what I want to say without any fear of being contradicted. I don't think there's really a lot of denialism anymore. I don't think that's the way that anybody is trying to preserve the status quo. I think at this point, the argument is that we can't afford to get off oil and gas. It's not that oil and gas and fossil fuels aren't emitting CO2 and causing a problem. It's that, in fact, of course they are, and we need to get off them, but we can't get off them now, we'll get off them later. And that we have huge demand for energy around the world, and that energy can really only be met through the existing financeable sources of coal, oil and gas, and mostly oil and gas. So when you think about doomerism, which is the second big meme in terms of energy and climate, which is we're destroying the natural world and there's nothing that we can do to stop ourselves, we're on an inevitable course that we can't change, that is a much more real-time belief in this society than actual denialism of climate. And it's one which I also would say is, in which I said to my daughter Evie, I absolutely disagree. We are going to win this. There's a real question about how fast we win it, but there's no doubt in my mind that we will, in fact, get to net zero. And, you know, the idea that we're screwed and therefore there's nothing we can do but throw up our hands and, you know, try and avoid the problem and not think about it actually is a very dangerous way to think. And so it's a big reason I wrote the book, because I want people to understand that, in fact, this is a challenge. It's a major challenge, but it's one we definitely can meet and will meet. And the faster we do it, the better off we'll be.
Would you consider your optimism here to be particular to this topic, or is this just as much a personality trait?
So let me rephrase that question. Oftentimes, people's expectations and projections say more about them than they do about what they're projecting about. I take that point. I will argue in my own defense that I spend almost all of my time, pretty much all my time on this topic, and I specifically spend it looking at new technologies, what the possibilities are, looking at the costs of different deployable energy sources and all the different new ideas that are coming up. So in defense of what I'm saying, I will say that I look across this spectrum and I see that we are winning in multiple ways, and the so-called hard to abate sectors are in places where I believe we will solve those. And so it's not just that, you know, I wake up in the morning and think, what a great day here in San Francisco, California, it's all good. I am looking at the comparative business analysis of what is cheaper, faster, and better, and that my belief that's the only way we're going to win. So if I say we're going to win, it's because I think that, you know, renewable energy is a lot cheaper than fossil fuel energy, and therefore, inevitably, that's going to give us a big advantage.
You frame the book in part as a way of trying to motivate people to find out what they personally can do to fight climate change. And I'm wondering, doesn't that run the risk of playing into the hands of a dynamic that we've seen before, say, the plastics and fossil fuel industry telling us that we could recycle everything, and it turns out, actually, we can't really recycle all that much plastic. I think a lot of people feel bereft about the climate because it's not that they don't feel humanity couldn't solve it, but that the people with power either don't want to or don't care, and they themselves have no agency against those forces.
So I actually think that's a great point, Clara. I do, and I hope that's not how it came across, because I was trying to make 2 points that I hope can coexist logically. The first point is that we all have responsibilities in terms of what our own profile is. You know, what you choose to drive, how you choose to heat your house, how you choose to travel, the kind of job you choose to do does have impact, and I think it's important for us all to take the agency that we can. But I specifically say in the book that the idea of footprint shaming, the idea of going around, which the fossil fuel industry has specifically used to try and take away the agency of strong advocates about climate response. So they've gone after Al Gore, they've gone after John Kerry to say, oh, they fly on private planes, therefore you should never listen to them because they're hypocrites. The real point here is we need system change, which is exactly the point you're making, not perfect people. No one in this room is a perfect person, led by me, and none of us is going to be able to solve this individually. This is system change. So when I talk about people taking responsibility, one of the absolute basic points here is who you vote for. It's who you support, whether this is a voting issue for you, whether in fact you insist that our system change and that no one who is opposing that gets your vote, to me is a critical question here. And I try and compare it in the book to World War II, where it is true that people had victory gardens and they did a lot of things on their own and people did sacrifice and believe in it. But also we didn't manufacture a passenger car in Detroit for 4 years because we were building boats and planes and tanks. And that was a system change. It was a choice to build the machinery so that we as a country and we as allies would have the ability to win that war. And no one person could have made that decision. That was something that Franklin Delano Roosevelt chose.
I'm curious, I just want to follow up a little bit on this because I do think that that's one of the central tensions. You are obviously advocating that the forces of capitalism within some guardrails can be a great accelerant of helpful change and technological advance. But the things that we have built that have been big and groundbreaking have tended to come, at least at the beginning, from government investment, whether that's a war effort or DARPA or, you know, name your thing. And so where do you see the balance in the sort of trying to inspire people to either invest, whatever level that they can do that, and to really look for the engines of ingenuity and innovation through a market-based system and something that is more directed by the state?
So I think in almost every instance, it's a public-private partnership, and that it isn't even like, I mean, the easiest way to think about this is that the government sets the rules, and then the private sector acts within those rules. The two things that I do strongly believe that scale in this world are government and profits. You know, if you want to build something, if you think about what from this part of the country has made a difference in the whole world in the last 70 years, it's companies that scaled to global size. Government and profit scale. But let me make another point. It's not just that government makes rules and then the private sector acts. In this case, if you think about just solar for a second, government gave people incentives to drive down the cost curves. So in 2000, solar was so much more expensive than fossil fuels that if they'd mandated solar, people would have rebelled because it would have been such a huge hole in the economy. It's kind of like they spent the money for the research, governments paid people to put solar on their roof. As we built more solar, the cost of solar went down. When the cost of solar goes down, then you get to mandate it. And it's kind of an interactive process between what the government enables, what the private sector does, what that enables the government to do as we build a whole system. And so it's always going to be this interactive process, but the way that it's going to get expressed is solar that's much cheaper than fossil fuels, and therefore that gets adopted in 2023 globally in 86% of the new electricity generation.
So I think a large part of our conversation is sort of predicated a little bit on people having at least a basic understanding of what the Inflation Reduction Act did to create a different market and regulatory landscape, and that was a mouthful. But if you wanted to just summarize what you think the opportunity that piece of legislation and related pieces of legislation have made possible.
So the extremely infelicitously named Inflation Reduction Act, which has nothing to do with inflation or reduction, but is an act, I'll give them that. As Claire and I were discussing, it's really an attempt, instead of taxing people for polluting, it's paying people who don't pollute. It's sort of a tax on its head. And it's really got two parts. One is about deployment of existing technologies. So they're basically giving people a lot of incentive to deploy renewables, to push on hydrogen, to deploy things that are available technologies. Maybe they're already cheaper and better, but to move it out as fast as possible, and also to drive down the cost curves in the ones where they still have to do that to win in the marketplace on a pure commodity basis. That's half of it, and that's what's gotten all the attention, and that's the $400 billion that everybody talks about, and that's about deployment. But the other half of it, which is actually, from a dollar standpoint, if it works out the way it's designed, will be more than half of it, is about innovation. Basically trying to seed hundreds of innovations throughout the economy which are not yet necessarily at product market fit, to get it to be ubiquitous and to come up with, the cliche in climate response is we're not looking for silver bullet, we're looking for silver buckshot. We're looking for hundreds of things, and the innovation part of this is really very low-cost loans. So when we think about this in total, it's an attempt to basically use American technology, American manufacturing, and American business expertise to build out the technologies that can then be global, which allows the rest of the world, which is still not built out to the extent that certainly we are, to adopt technologies that are cheaper and better and also clean. That's the goal of the IRA, and to a very large extent, the whole point is to get, if they put in $400 billion, they're trying to get 4 or 5 times that from the private sector, so that it's actually a much bigger move than just the government.
Very hard thing to boil down to a bumper sticker, would you say?
Well, I will say, so if you ever look at the polls about what young people know in terms of the Biden administration and its impact on climate, if you ask young people, they go like, they've done nothing on climate. And if you say, no, they've done by far the biggest climate act in American history, multiples of anything that's ever happened before, they're like, really? No kidding. So it is hard to boil down to a bumper sticker. It is, I wasn't just joking, it's a lousy name. They have a great story to tell. They have less than 6 months to tell it, and I'm hoping that they're out there singing that song, and I'm trying to sing a little bit of that song for them right now.
You mentioned, and I think that you're right, when it comes to young people, that you're much more likely to hear about the Biden administration, say, passing the Willow Pipeline project than anything that's come out of the IRA or any of the other initiatives that they've done. You are a solicitor and expert on the youth vote. Why do you think that? Is it because technocratic solutions don't have the same kind of narrative appeal for anybody, but maybe particularly for younger voters?
Well, as a very smart journalist said to me about half an hour ago when we were waiting to come out here, which we all know, people live on stories, not data. Very few people like to think in numbers. People like to tell stories, and there's a real story in we're going to develop, for oil and gas purposes, a really remote and beautiful place in the world. That is something most people can picture. Most people can't picture $400 billion. They really, if you talk about the IRA, everything I talked about, none of that was a great story. So when we think about what we're trying to do, I think we have to, the reason I wrote this book is we have to think about this in a different way. We have to think about this in a human way about what we're trying to accomplish, and a story that's meaningful to human beings when they get up in the morning and think about what they're doing with their life and who they love and how they want to see themselves. And that, I think, is a huge opportunity for us as Americans. I think this is a huge opportunity for us to accomplish things and succeed and win, and that's something Americans love to do. And I think for us to do this, we're going to have to do it across geography, across party lines, across all the different ways that we're divided, and go back to accepting each other's strength and patriotism. And doing that winning that way will be a great experience for us. It will be a wonderful opportunity to remind ourselves what it feels like to win together. And that is something that we have got to step up and do. And that's something that traditionally people in this country have been willing to do. And I can tell you, winning teams love each other. I played a lot of sports teams. On a winning team, every kooky guy on your team is a terrific guy. And that's how this will be. If we step up and do this, we'll remind ourselves how smart and patriotic and tough the people in Texas are. And that's what we need to do. We need to remind ourselves that we can disagree in a democracy, we can disagree and yell at each other, and then remember that we're actually shared. What we're trying to do is the same thing. We're trying to create the same thing, and you're allowed to disagree and fight within a family, and that's fine. But winning together is really fun.
There's one counterfactual that kind of looms in my mind when I hear you say that we did face a global pandemic 4 years ago, and I would argue that the one real triumph of the Trump administration was Project Warp Speed. We did get a vaccine developed. We did, there's a lot of waste, there's a lot of graft, I don't like Jared Kushner, et cetera. But we did get that deployed, and yet the country not only didn't rally around that success, it has torn itself apart. We had hearings today grilling Fauci, so what, so there is both the success, but there is the sharing in that success. And I'm wondering what part of the IRA maybe is trying to do that by distributing battery plants into rural Georgia or wherever. But what are some other mechanisms that you could see to actually have that narrative shared success?
Well, I think in order to have a narrative, you have to tell a narrative. I mean, it doesn't seem that complicated to me. I mean, I think what happened in World War II was there was a huge conflict within the United States about whether we should fight that war. I mean, people forget that before Pearl Harbor, we were sort of frozen because half of this country was saying it's a European fight, we're broke, don't forget we're still in the Depression, we can't afford to do this because we don't have the money, and it's not our problem, and anyone who wants to do this is really just, adventuring. And I think that what happened was we came to a shared narrative, frankly, because they blew up the Pacific Fleet, that was we have to do this together. And that was the end of what continued to be a broken narrative about COVID, which we never came to we know how to solve this. It's incredible that we're doing this. Let's get behind this and acknowledge how great it is. That never happened. And honestly, this is about leadership. I mean, FDR was a great president. He was the person who could see through. He's the person who told us a story about the Depression, about how we should think differently about each other and about our relationship to the government. And he's the person who told us differently about what we were trying to accomplish in World War II. This is about explaining the world to each other and accepting each other as part of the solution. And that is, if you think about whoever you think the greatest leader you have in your mind and think about what she or he did, that's what they did. They had a narrative to explain the world differently that people accepted, and that changed the world. And that's what we're talking about here, explaining to each other what it is we're trying to do, and in so doing, who we are.
So do you think that this is going to have to be a sort of top-down messaging, or is this going to have to be a sort of, grassroots messaging? Because, FDR had the advantage, among others, of, essentially having one form of media to share things with, and everybody turned into the same radio station. It's not that simple, but you ran for president, you know the fractured media landscape that we face and how problematic it is, even if you're a very good messenger, to execute on a message. Is that likely to come from the top?
So I'm just going to quote somebody smart because I don't have anything smart to say. I think Abe Lincoln said, with public opinion, almost anything is possible. Without public opinion, almost nothing is possible. This can't be a top-down thing. There has to be leadership. But the idea, I'm a believer in the dispersed intelligence and power of the American people. If we don't buy it, it doesn't happen. And so does there have to be a narrative? Yes. But do people have to say, that hits me, that is true, they are telling me a truth that I accept for myself and my family and can get behind? Yes. And so I kind of think it's the same interactive process that I was talking about in terms of government and business. That, yeah, FDR was saying things, but he didn't move until he could move, until he thought he had enough people behind him. And that's the history of leadership, is trying to point the way, but understanding that really the people make it happen.
So, in general, it seems like you're a big fan of Biden's climate, at least the IRA agenda, but less so of the protective parts of it, less so of the possible tariffs on Chinese EVs, or the requirements that EVs and so forth be made here to get a subsidy. And I'm just wondering, putting the labor issues aside, since you're not currently running for president, what do you think of the argument that onshoring green tech, even if it takes longer to scale up, is such an important national security and future proofing that we need to force it to be made here?
So I think, if politics is the art of the possible, which is really what it is, you can't just design a system and say, that's what we're doing, and everyone should understand that my econ poli-sci homework is how we're going to proceed as a country. When I look at this, there's a straightforward trade-off in terms of the speed from an environmental standpoint. People supposedly are incredibly worried about inflation. I think that a $14,000 EV that goes 1,200 miles has something to say about inflation, as well as the environment. And I think that at the same time, somehow you've got to get all these things through, and so you're taking into account specific jobs in specific places and trying to make sure that you have enough support from the varied parts of this country to get it through, and then to make sure that it doesn't get undone. And so it's always a very complicated trade-off of a whole bunch of different things. And so I do think from an environmental standpoint, winning slowly is going to result in a massive amount of human suffering. And I think the question is, it's always going to be a trade-off of figuring out what we can get done, what is possible, and trying to maximize that in a way that is a very complicated and imperfect process.
Do you see rolling over the fleet to be one of, if not the leading lever to move? Or, another sort of thing we could pull on is say we do some sort of massive permitting reform so that we can string transmission lines to hook up the new, solar arrays and so forth. What, if you're a genie, what do you get first?
So it's funny. There is a great, it's free, by the way. You can go online to an MIT program where you try every different thing and see what happens. So it's like you go, we plant 1 trillion trees. What happens? Not much. Okay. We put in a carbon tax, and you put in different carbon taxes per ton, price per ton, and you see what happens. So when you look at that, do I think that the transportation part of this is big? The transportation part of this is definitely big. Is the electricity generation part of this big? The electricity part of this is very big. What we don't see in that sometimes is some of the things that don't fit into the stories of the gadgets that are going to change the world. So we don't look at agriculture. Agriculture is both a huge emitter and can be a huge place to sequester. We don't look that much at some of the manufacturing places, and we don't look at the built environment. We don't look at what the buildings, all the different kinds of buildings in this country, 80% of which will still be in use in 2050. We don't look at the emissions from the built environment. And so, do all of those matter? I mean, they all matter. Cement and concrete are 8% of emissions. It matters. You know, in different parts of the world, different parts of those different verticals do different percentages. But ultimately, as I said, this is going to be silver buckshot, and we're going to have to get all of them. And I think some of the solutions are not going to be, we tend to think the solutions are going to be gadgets like the ones that Henry Ford invented. And, you know, I believe that it's going to, a lot of the things that are going to solve this are going to be very different from that.
Can you say a little bit more about that? You were talking about software as a sort of maximizer of efficiency.
Well, let me give you, I was talking about all the information stuff, which I do want to talk about, but let me just give you an example. I mean, one of the things that anyone who lives in California knows, it's very hard to get permits here to do anything. You know, when we were first living in the Haight, we wanted to put a window in our living room, and we went down to City Hall and said, we'd like to put a window in our living room. And the guy said, you know, we're not permitting renovations in the Sunset. I said, that's good, because we're not doing a renovation, and we're not in the Sunset. He said, did you hear me? No. It's hard to get permits here sometimes, and everybody knows it. And so what it seems to me we're going to have to do is see what we can do within the existing footprint. That's what everybody in California does. If it's really hard to get a permit and it's 7 years to get built offshore wind in California, if you get it done, and you think about, we kind of have 7 years to solve this, to really get a move on this. A 7-year permit timing kind of takes you out of 7 years of impact. So we're looking about what can you do on the existing footprint, what can you do on the roofs, as opposed to rebuilding another whole grid and all the issues with that, which we all know are gigantic. What can we do in the existing grid to carry multiples of electricity in the existing framework? So to me, a lot of this is going to be about how do we change what we're doing and avoid the human issues, the human permitting, the human grid issues, with technologies that get around that. The other thing that Clara is referring to is I'm a huge believer that 21st century problem, 21st century solution. 21st century solution, information, real-time information. That's what I believe will be the strategic answer that allows us actually to win.
So say a little bit more about that. You're sort of, if I understand, you're sort of imagining that in a sense that the market will create a carbon tax of sorts, that we'll know what the emissions are for things, and somehow that will be priced in or penalized or rewarded or whatever, but that will spread around the globe. How will that work?
So hopefully I'm not exactly that much of a wishful thinker. Although what Clara says is somewhat is the way I think. But let me say this: the message about information, which probably we've all heard, is if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. If you don't know what you're trying to change, how do you change it? And so, to a very large extent, as long as you're not measuring your emissions, then you have plausible deniability in front of the judge, where they go like, "Do you know how much you're emitting?" And the answer is, "Your Honor, I had no idea." Now that I know, I'm definitely going to do something about it, but Your Honor, I had no idea. So the real question in my mind is, from an emissions and a sequestration standpoint, how do we in fact know what the carbon footprint of this shirt is? Like, I don't know, the person who sold me it doesn't know, and the person who manufactured it doesn't know. And until we know what actually people are doing, they can't solve it, they can't be charged for it, and really, no one can get a handle on this. Now, it is true that if we really know the carbon footprint of everything, that enables governments to do a lot of things, but it enables all of us to do a lot of things. And so when I think about strategically what allows us to get a handle on it, I would say if you look at the emissions profile of the globe through last year, we have done a lot of gadgets. we have a much better energy intensity per ton of CO2 emitted. Having said that, emissions went up 1.1% in 2023. So if the real measurement is total emissions of CO2 and CO2 equivalents in a year, that's not a good year. And I like to say, you can't go down by going up. Not complicated, but we're never going to get to go down until we know what we're doing. And I believe that strategically, when we can measure that stuff, then all the possibilities for strategic change become realistic. And when that happens, I believe we will inevitably have the ability to win this. And until that happens, we may get emissions to go down, but we really are not strategically able to look at it and make a decision as 8 billion people.
I hear what you're saying. On the other hand, I know that the chocolate ice cream in my freezer is fattening, and I probably should not eat it. But if it is there in my freezer, I will eat it. So what is the mechanism by which we will somehow make individuals or corporations or governments act for the greater good and, only eat the ice cream every once in a while?
So let me say this. The book is called Cheaper, Faster, Better. And the idea is that we're going to win in the marketplace. But as I said earlier, that is going to be a combination of government and business. And so knowing what people are doing, both the people who are doing it and everybody else, including governments, but not just limited to governments, in my mind is going to give us the ability to make the changes that are necessary. But people are going to, in this whole process, the one thing that I have concluded is that no one is going to be nice. We are not, and I'll give you the most obvious example, just so you know. If you look at where the emissions are coming from in the world, the growth last year was up 1.1%. The US went down 4%, just so you know. Europe went down 4%. China went up 7%, and India went up 5%. All the growth in emissions in this world are going to come from places that don't have anything like the energy intensity of the United States. And so that's going to be really populous places, first in Asia and then in Africa. And so if you go to India and say to them, we want you to do only clean energy, it's going to be a lot more expensive, but it's the right thing to do. They are going to say, you guys have done almost all the emissions so far. You guys are much richer than us. You guys continue to emit per capita many multiples of what Indians do. And we're the problem, really. You're asking us to stay poor so you can continue to emit. Really, that's your solution. They're not happy about it. They're not wrong. So when we think about how this is going to work, they're going to make decisions that are good for them. And those decisions have got to be ones that are also clean. And that's why I said cheaper, faster, better. 86% electricity generation, new electricity generation, renewable last year. People weren't being nice. They were being smart. They're being self-interested. And that's the one thing we can count on. That's what's going to happen. So they also know, just so you guys know, India's really at risk. I mean, if you look around this globe, who is going to suffer? The rule is the less you've done to cause the problem, the more you're going to suffer. That's the rule. And India hasn't done very much to cause the problem. And if you look at the water situation in India, it will curl your hair. So they know that too. So in all of this, it's going to take cooperation. We have a real role to play. We have a good role to play. We have an important role to play. We can't do it by ourselves, for sure. Getting us to zero does not solve this problem, I assure you. So we have a much bigger role to play in the globe as part of the global community, as leaders in technology and finance, and honestly, as people who can be trusted. We have a real role to play, and an important one we should, in my mind, grasp together and be really proud of.
Has Detroit done, okay. Detroit has pretty much blown the EV revolution thus far. Like it got the IRA, they got the credits. They could have started more, there's supply chain problems and all this and that. But basically, they took the few small sedans that were quite good
Gone.
off the market, and what all electric vehicles have been introduced have mostly been giant monsters. And meanwhile, Elon Musk has turned into a Bond villain, or always was. So here's a case of we have a new company, California-based company, very all those things, and Detroit, and they're sort of in their own individual ways, kind of blowing the moment that's been handed to them. How can we be sure that the market will be smart?
So, I think one of the things that is just a sad but true fact is it's very hard for the status quo winners to blow up the status quo. So if you look at a car company in Detroit, they were making like 10 grand per SUV and losing 2 grand per EV. And everyone's like, you got to make more EVs. You're like, what? That makes no economic sense for us. We make 10 grand every time we make an SUV, and you want us to lose all our money. Plus, everyone in that company who's responsible for the success of that company makes SUVs. So politically within the company, that's who has all the juice. So how is that company going to throw out everything they've done and all the people who've done it? And plus, their shareholders own that company for a completely different reason. They own it because it makes a bunch of money. The people in Tesla owned it because they bought the dream. So it's a completely different set of shareholder expectations. And so they weren't getting credit for like the dream. It's like the dream, your profits are down 25%. So it's really, really, really hard for people in that situation to blow up their own company on a bet that the next generation company will be worth more. And if you look, it hardly ever happens. That is not how the world works. What ends up happening is some pirate from outside the status quo comes up with something different, and basically there's an S curve, which has been going. The idea that the new technology fights to get to cost parity. And then when it does, it shoots right up, and then it flattens out around 80%. And if you think that's been going on since we got rid of whale blubber, people thought the whale was the future in 1840 in Nantucket, and it turned out they weren't right. And that's how technology works: is people really, really, really believe that in only marginal changes, and when step functions happen, which don't happen that much, but when they do, and you think about newspapers. Newspapers thought that the internet would hurt their sale of classified and hurt the growth in classified, but it actually destroyed the newspapers. And so it's very hard for those big three automakers to throw out 100 years of success on a bet that the EV is going to be their future, really. And that's true. Look at what the fossil fuel companies are doing. It is really hard for the oil and gas companies to say we're now energy companies and we're going to do wind and solar, and that's our future.
But it's interesting if you need to retool the fleet, whether or not you impose big tariffs on Chinese EVs. Those production lines are here and they're running, and the quickest way to build cars is on factories that already exist to build cars. So I'm just curious, when you look at that landscape alone, do you think okay, our best hope is that one of those companies decides to make a bold choice, or Toyota does?
Well, I hate to say it, but if you look at what the market is saying, the market's saying it's new companies are going to do that. Tesla's still worth $550 billion this morning, I think. And so people are betting that actually the new technology is going to come out of new technology companies, and that it's going to be really hard for the existing companies to retool and make it profitable. And so far they've been right. The market has been projecting that it would be hard for them to do it, and so far it's been very hard for them to do it.
Capitalism isn't necessarily very good at pure research or that's not been its track record. It's sort of built off the pure research. Do you think what you're talking about, the buckshot approach, is that small companies innovating small changes and it all kinds of adds up? Or do we need like a DARPA, TVA style
So-
massive project?
So the DARPA's the defense, basically seeding defense research. And we have it. That is how this stuff is happening. I mean, if you look around to the great research universities of the United States and the great research labs, they're funded by the U.S. government. Stanford, MIT, Cal, UCSF, that money's coming out of NIH, DOD, DOE, Department of Agriculture. Research in this country, not development so much, but research in this country is done on the government's nickel. It's really important. I think it's a great government expenditure in terms of impact, in terms of, the economy, jobs, all the things that people want. So, but absolutely, I've looked at the P&Ls of those big universities, and the government is a very hefty contributor to them, to the research.
You started a new investment fund, Galvanize Capital, to seed, propel, take advantage of, I'm not sure what the right adjective, maybe all three, of green tech. And I skimmed the deck, and it seems like one of the things that you guys are proposing is figuring out the intricacies of the IRA and other regulatory bodies, and then where to invest accordingly. Like you talk about, say in real estate, accelerating investments in renewable energy, high efficiency heating and cooling, and whole building retrofits, which sounds great. Please do that downtown.
If you'll bring me the tanks, we'll do it downtown.
What happens if Trump turns around and dismantles this regulatory apparatus that's been built?
So chasing government dollars as a way of investing seems to me to be a highly fraught and risky, unsuccessful process. So I hope that's not what we're doing. If you look at what we're doing, so let me just take the example that Clara started with, which was real estate. So basically we have a real estate fund that buys buildings that are normal buildings using normal energy, and we're trying to take them to net zero and prove that you can make a lot more money doing that.
So it's not dependent on a subsidy being involved in the chain, or
it may well be involved in what local jurisdictions allow for solar. So as everybody in California knows, people pay different amounts for solar at different times to different people. And understanding what you're going to get paid for generating electricity on your roof is part of understanding the economics of putting solar on your roof. And if you're not going to get paid for it, it's not very effective to spend the money on all those solar panels, and it's not very effective to fix your roof so it can hold those solar panels. So yes, it is dependent on understanding policy, but in this case, it's much more local policy. It's not federal policy. It is also, so when we think about that, federal government, different administration in Washington, D.C., not nearly as relevant as, what goes on in Sacramento. And normally what happens in any one of those jurisdictions is existing people get grandfathered. So to a very large extent, it's understanding how things work and being smart about, look, we got to get paid for electricity we generate. This has got to work from a return standpoint, because our whole point is this has got to happen. We are not going to buy all the buildings in the United States of America, no matter what. We might like to, but it ain't going to happen. What we need to show is that doing this makes a much more valuable building, so that everybody who doesn't give a hoot in Hades about climate thinks, I'm not stupid. I'm going to make more money too. I'm going to go put solar on the roof. I'm not dumb. That's what we need to prove this works. And we need to have a toolbox that works so people can understand, and we need to develop the technologies to reskin the building and all the other stuff, all of which we're doing.
Are microgrids part of this? I'm sorry to geek out a little bit.
No.
Okay.
Let me say this. If you look at the utility system of the United States, it has I'll give you the integrity of it. The integrity of the utility system of the United States is 24/7, 365. We're going to be up 24/7, 365. That's our job. Now, after that, it kind of breaks down. because it's a cost-plus system. So, there's no reason to innovate. There's no reason to do anything except 24/7, 365. So I'll give you some numbers just to put it in your head. The median company in Silicon Valley will adopt a new technology in 18 months. So the 50th percentile company, a year and a half after somebody comes up with a new technology, will buy it and install it. For an electric utility, it's 35 years. 35 years. Because, we did this thing. I have these friends from business school who make these investments, and they're technology people and they're friends of mine. So when they call me and say, do it, I do it. And great. And so they called me up, and we had this thing called ice bears. I will get back to the microgrids, I hope. And ice bears were basically ice, like this new thing. You make ice when electricity is cheap, and when electricity is expensive, the ice melts, and that creates energy, and you sell it at a high price. That's the whole thing. There's nothing else to it. There's no technology risk. It's a good deal. So we sold nothing. We go into the utility guys, and they'd be like, let's have a meeting in 6 months. We're like, no, this works. This is a good deal. They're like, shut up, get out. I'm playing golf. So I'm sitting at my desk. We started in like 2012. In 2017, I'm sitting at my desk, and I read in the paper that SoCal Edison has bought $350 million worth of ice bears. $350 million, because they had to close the San Onofre nuclear plant because they built it on the San Andreas Fault. And it turns out that's not smart. So they made them close it, and they had to have energy. They bought 3 things, one of which was $350 million worth of ice bears. So I call up my friend who put me in this investment. I go, Pete, we're rich. He goes, what are you talking about? I go, didn't you see in the paper? We couldn't sell $350,000 worth of ice bears. We couldn't sell $350 worth of ice bears. I said, we're rich. We sold $350 million of ice bears to SoCal Edison yesterday. He goes, Tom, we did a washout financing. You got nothing. Sorry, pal. My point being, from an investment standpoint, from a tech standpoint, they don't do it unless someone puts a gun to their head. The ice bears always worked. There's no incentive in a cost-plus business to do anything but the simplest, oldest technology, because it's just like, we build it and we get 10% on top of it. Great. Why take a risk? Why do anything? Why believe that ice melts? Don't have to believe that. And so microgrids is a way to try and put people together to get outside this system where basically there's a rate base and they stick everything in the rate base, and every mistake is in the rate base, and that's just overhead that their customers have to pay for their mistakes. And a microgrid is to say, no, actually, monopolies don't work for 100 years. We'll do something amongst ourselves that is a hell of a lot cheaper. It's very hard to do in California, by the way, just so you know.
Yes, if you had to pick our worst utility, it's a jump ball between PG&E and Southern Electric. I wanted to ask you, you've obviously done very well in life, and
is it the shoes that
the
made you
shoes?
say that,
We're still
Clara?
obsessing over your shoes.
Because
yeah.
I will be auctioning the shoes off for cash money at the end of this.
And you've come out in favor of a wealth tax. I think it started kicking in when someone had a net worth of $31 million. Warren's, I think, was $50 million. And I guess I'm wondering, why such a high threshold? I mean, honestly, like, has someone done the math and, like, we got to let the first group of billion,
Well, you're the first person to attack it from that side. let me
I'm
say.
sure, well, it's probably who you run with.
Look,
but-
here's what I would say about wealth and wealth taxes. I am a huge believer in people working really hard and creating things. I mean, we live in California. That's what this country, this state is built on, is new ideas, entrepreneurship, young companies, growth, and dreaming big and trying to make it happen. I mean, I always say to people, the image of success in California is you go into a garage with your best friend and try and change the world. The image of success in New York is you become a partner at Goldman Sachs. It's a pretty different image, and our image is that. So I love that. Do I believe that it's really good for society to have a group of people with inherited wealth over generations with immense power and influence who I don't. So that's why I thought a wealth tax, that's the first thing is I do believe in this, in the idea that people should be allowed to make a ton of money. I also believe having that money be around to control politics and influence things, I don't think is very healthy for society. So
31 million seems like the right number.
there is no right. I always say there is no God in the tax rate. Like 28%, 31%, God doesn't care. People, what I was trying to say is really with a wealth tax is this. Nobody made their money. Maybe they did create the company. Maybe they did work their asses off. Maybe they are really smart. But there have been poor sons of bitches going out to make this system work since Runnymede. And those poor sons of bitches got nothing for that except maybe get killed. So I think we owe the system that they created and made a huge debt of thanks. Everybody, nobody makes their own money in this system. Everybody, the system works to make it possible. And if you think that's my money, I made it, no one else made it for me, I would argue that that is an incredibly selfish and arrogant thing to say. This system, people sacrificed everything.
Because I think getting kind of back to in part young voters, I think when people sort of say to folks, listen, the market can fix this problem, the market can do this and that, most people don't have, like, they're lucky if they have a couple months of expenses in a savings account. They don't have any money to, maybe they have a 401k, maybe, but they don't have any money to invest, and they don't see capitalism working for them on climate or anything else. So, you must have really encountered this in your work with young voters. I mean, I think it's really been increasing that critique. And how do you, as someone who does believe in the market as at least a large part of the fix here, how do you kind of make that case to them?
Look, if it's not shared prosperity, it's not working. And you think about what is the government's role here is to make sure that the rules work for the people of the United States. That's the job. And if it's not working for the people of the United States, it's not working. And that means the rules should change. And I think that we've gotten into this meme of, which I think is just demonstrably false, that somehow low taxes drive productivity and low taxes drive growth, which, let me say, bullshit. That's just bullshit. If you go and look at the lowest tax, if you go and look at what Kansas did by lowering their tax rates and destroying their education system, that is not a way to succeed as a state. If you look at, and I'll give you just one example. So in 1970, Ohio and Massachusetts had the same income per person, the same GDP per capita. Ohio reduced their tax rates a lot, ruined their education system. Massachusetts worked their ass off. They have one of the best education systems, maybe the best education system in the United States. Their net income per person today is 50% higher than Ohio's. If you think that not investing in the people of your society is a way to make that society work, that is absurd in an information age. That's just absurd. The only thing, the idea of not making it work for the average person, this is not going to, I have no interest. I don't believe a society works with this level, this oligarchy controlling the mass of dissatisfied people. Can't work, doesn't work politically, doesn't work in any sense. That's not how it's going to work in the 21st century. This is an information age. We're in it together. Let's get over it and let each other succeed. That's the only way it's going to work. And so I have when we think about, that's the government's job. And if the people who are being taxed, if you ask them what they should be taxed, nothing sounds good. Okay, that doesn't work. So that's the job of the government, is to set the rules so it works for society, so it works for the people in this society.
I don't want to hog the mic here, so I think that we're going to take some audience questions, and I'm not, if you want to raise your hand, maybe we're doing it that way.
This is a very polite group of people, other than my relatives.
Halfway back.
Please keep the mics away from anyone I'm related to.
Sorry. Okay. Sorry.
Oh, sorry. Tom, I want to actually thank you for you talking about the information being the key decider in terms of climate, scaling climate. Your role in passing SB 253 is something my partner and I drafted, conceived of, brought it to Senator Wiener. You made a critical difference in a political way to having that pass, bringing the private sector and bringing big corporate actors to the table. So thank you for that. But also, that to me is like, it's not just an investment government coming together. It's also about policy where private and government come together in that way. I'm not going to ask you what's next, although I'd love to hear, but how do you see that playing out? Because California drives the U.S. market in that sense, but we also have the rest of the globe to scale up.
So for those of you who don't know, every single Senate bill that is passed every single year in Sacramento, SB 253 was basically requiring companies that operate in California and over $1 billion worth of revenues to basically be transparent about through scope 3 in terms of their emissions. So that means right down through their supply chain. So not just what do they do in their travel, not just what do they do in their factory, but what do they do if they're producing things, and what their supply chain is doing in producing the goods along the way. And the reason it's so important is this. I mean, for goodness sakes, it's the 21st century. If you are transparent about that in Sacramento, California, you are also transparent about that by definition in Timbuktu. You're transparent in Beijing, you're transparent in Rio, you're transparent in Paris. Once it's on the internet, it's all over the world. So if California requires disclosure, we don't, someone in DC called me up and said, if you guys do this, we'll do it in DC. And I was like, why? Once we've required it, everybody knows it already. That the SEC specifically said they wouldn't do it. So from an information standpoint, understanding what people are doing so that they understand it, so that they don't have plausible deniability, so that there's transparency to the world, to me is a critical step for us to get a handle on this. It's a very important bill.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. Hi, Tom. How are you? As a fellow climate tech investor, I had to ask, what's more important to prioritize right now? Shutting off the faucet into the bathtub or draining the bathtub? Electrification or carbon cap? I had to ask the question. Thank you.
So I'm not sure I understood the question, so let me see if I can rephrase it. What is the metaphor about shutting off the water to the bathtub or draining the bathtub? Is it a question about sequestration versus emissions?
Yeah, it's some people, several books that I've been reading about it, and several investors have the view that we should electrify and then concentrate all of our capital investment priorities on electrification versus carbon capture and just like sucking out the CO2 that was emitted.
So just to put I started by saying everything's a story, so now I'm just going to give you straight up numbers. Sorry. I mean, to put it in context, and these numbers are all a little squishy and people report them differently, but basically 42 gigatons of emissions a year. So, and people think to get to, and these are all guesses, to get to net zero by 2050, we'll need to sequester 10 gigatons. So that's reduced by 32 and sequester 10. So in answer to your question, 32 is still higher than 10. Now, having said that, it gets complicated, but the real point here is for us to get to net zero, we're going to have to reduce our emissions by at least 3/4. And getting to net zero is not going to be enough. I think that there's pretty much acknowledgement that we're going to have to get to a place where we're net negative because we're going to be in a place at that point that is not safe.
And I think when a lot of people hear sequestration, they think, oh, the stuff comes out of the smoke pipe in the factory and we just capture it right there. But you were saying, particularly when it comes to fossil fuels, that equation doesn't really work out.
So what Clara is referring to is there is a sense, and people are doing this, and it does actually physically work to basically suck CO2 out of the air, which is a very energy-intensive thing to do, and then build a pipeline to pipe it to like an empty oil field, a depleted oil field, or a cavern, and stick it down there in perpetuity. So people are doing this with, may I say, mostly government dollars, as far as I can tell. And it's very, very, very expensive. And as far as I can tell, so to put it in context, the lowest number I've heard for this right now is about $600 a ton. And the way to think about $600 a ton, which doesn't mean anything to anybody, for every $100, it's $1 per gallon of gas. So at $600 a ton, that's a $6 gas tax per gallon. Not going to happen in the real world. So the alternative, and the other question is, how much do you have to build to make this happen? Like from a physical capability, what would you have to build? How many pipelines? How many caverns? How many machines? My strong belief, which might be wrong because all technology is like, doesn't always go the way you think, is that this can't scale. That literally to do this, you would have to rebuild the whole oil and gas sector multiple times. Not going to happen. So the question is, okay, but if you need to actually suck it out of the sky, how are you going to do that without sucking it out of the sky? And the alternative is using nature. You know, when I was unfortunately snidely talking about planting trees, and it's not that planting trees don't do nothing, it just takes a long time for trees to grow. But there are multiple ways within nature to change the way we do agriculture, to use what's, you know, a lot of different techniques in the ocean and on the ground, to use what we're doing and change what we're doing and to sequester it through the natural parts, the way we act and the parts of nature that we can affect. And that seems, those numbers from a per ton basis are a fraction. You know, they usually center somewhere around $50 or lower. And the question is, well, and there's been a lot of controversy about this, so you should know. Like, does that really work? Like, don't the trees burn down? You know, you're paying people not to cut down trees, but maybe they cut down other trees, so it's not really a change. You're just paying people to do something that doesn't have any real impact. There's a lot of controversy about what goes on in terms of natural sequestration, whether it is additional and whether it's permanent. And so, and if you read The Guardian, which maybe a bunch of you guys read The Guardian has been very strident about the need for this to be closely measured, closely monitored, closely and verified. Because if you're going to pay people, you know, $1 trillion a year, you'd like to get something for it. And I think that, you know, I think that's a reasonable point of view.
Amazing. Thanks so much for being here, Tom. I'm wondering, it's obvious hearing you talk that there are a number of moving pieces that need to be solved to solve the climate crisis. There needs to be policy change from politicians. There needs to be investment from venture and private equity, and there needs to be founders and entrepreneurs who are building businesses. My question is, if you were graduating college today, given your skills and interests, which of these moving pieces would you tackle first if you're solely optimizing to make the biggest dent on the climate crisis that you could?
Well, I've been trying to suggest that it's kind of a big soup and that everything is necessary. I mean, what I have been saying to people, I mean, I can answer myself, but before I do this, what I say to people is, people are still going to do the jobs they want to do. You know, if you're an artist, you can't suddenly say, okay, now I'm going to work for the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers. That's not going to be the life you want. The question is, as an artist, how are you going to take climate into consideration? And that was, you know, when we were talking about it, we need societal change, but we need people to basically have this in their head as a priority for all of us, both collectively and individually. And that's actually how this will work. So when I think about myself, if I were 22 years old again, I would think about, what is the career I want to do, and then how can I do that from the standpoint of trying to be part of this? Look, for me, and I'm 66 years old, and so I have a different set of facts in front of me. I'm doing exactly what I want to do. I'm trying to invest to be part of the group of people to push the solutions faster, and then to make sure that that information's around so that they can be adopted and as quickly as possible. And so for me, econ poli-sci major with a business degree and decades of being an investor, that's what I think I can do. But, there's a lot of things that other people can do. If I can't make films, somebody can make films, somebody can write screenplays, somebody can do technology, somebody can, one of the examples I love to use is that one of the new sources of clean baseload energy is enhanced geothermal, basically going down into the Earth's crust and getting hot water and steam and using that as clean energy. And traditionally, geothermal has only been very close to the surface, hundreds of feet down, and this is thousands of feet down. And it's being done with oil and gas technology, literally oil and gas rigs, and oil and gas workers. Okay, here's a chance for people to make a difference, to change their career and get well paid for it, but also make a difference. So I think for all of us, it's a question of what are my skills, what are my interests, what can I do that will make a difference, and also let me lead a life. We're all gonna lead our lives. And I think this is just one of the things we do to try and organize it in a smart way.
Do you want me to stand up? Oh, I think I will. Hi, Tom. If your tagline for the book is "How we'll win the climate war," I guess my question for you is, how many naysayers would you want to give a copy of the book to? Because I'm sick and tired of people saying it's all about following a script with the climate, because I think one of my climate heroes, as much as I love him as an actor, is Leo DiCaprio, and I'd love to know, if you could give a copy of the book to the climate naysayers around here, the climate crisis isn't real, who would you want to give it to?
So let me say this. I believe this is a book that can be read and believed by just about everybody. I mean, one of the points I'm trying to make is this is a chance for actually us to come together, maybe not for all exactly from the exact same background, maybe not for exactly the same incentives, but it is really a chance for us to work on something together for different reasons and succeed. So I actually am very happy. I do want to, in fact, go to the places where, and I'll give you an example of something, go to the places that on the surface seem to be anti-renewable, anti-climate, sort of technology. And the example I use is Texas. Texas has tripled its solar in the last 3 years. It's supposed to go up another 35% this year. Texas does more wind by far than any other state. I mean, the legislators in Texas are claiming how terrible renewables are, but the businesses in Texas are building solar and wind. A lot more than us, by the way. So that's how I want to. I want to win because people make the choice, because it's a better deal, because it's smart. And, do I think that maybe some of these people will make rules that you can't do stuff? Maybe. But, as far as I can tell, people around the world are making the choices that make sense. And so we got to make sure that the choices that make sense are good. That's my goal. And so I want to go to those places and say, I'm not asking you to be nice. I always tell this story about this really good friend of mine who's, I believe, kind of a business, Republican, and who loves cars, who's from California, loves to drive fast cars, has had a bunch of expensive European sports cars. And he bought a Tesla 7 years ago. He reminded 8 years ago. I was like, Matthew, are you trying to save the world? And he goes hell no. This car has great pickup. You should see how this car handles. It's way better than those European sports cars. Okay, that works for me. Cheaper, faster, better. If we have that, we'll win.
I'm going to take 2 more questions.
Hi, Tom. I'm Jane Vosberg. I met you 10 years ago in CalSTRS.
Nice to see you.
Nice to see you, too. I'm just going to piggyback off the SB 253. This is SB 252 is coming up in the Assembly on June the 19th. And it has passed the Senate, but we desperately need Representative McKenna's vote for that to pass. And
What is SB 252?
excuse me, sorry, it's the divesting from fossil fuels of our public pension funds, CalPERS and CalSTRS. So we need a vote, and so if you have any tricks up your sleeve that you could help us with for that one, I'd really appreciate it. Thank you.
So let me say one thing about divesting. And I've been somebody who's been for divesting from oil and gas for a long time. At this point in our life, and I believe we need to be investing. I believe we need to be investing in the change. And if there was one thing that I would like our public pension funds to do, I would like people to put their money where their mouth is. Because this is going to happen, but it's going to happen a lot faster if people get behind it with big money. And I've been trying to go around the world, actually, to try to say to people, please put your money where your mouth is, because this is the future. It's going to be a better return. This is, a tailwind, but, in this world, people don't necessarily jump on change. And so the more we can get people to get behind this change with money, the real advantage that fossil fuels have is they're financeable. So if you look at what it costs to finance natural gas, you're in the mid-single digits. In terms of debt, if you look at what it costs to finance enhanced geothermal, it's probably 10% higher. And that may not sound like a lot, but that is a huge difference in terms of the profitability and the ability to scale. And so to me, getting finance, big-time money behind this is a critical part of actually winning in this. So my goal in this is invest in the change, invest in the transition, because it's inevitably going to happen. And I believe that fossil fuels are super risky. I believe that they're at risk in multiple ways going forward. And I honestly don't see how the change doesn't happen.
Could take one last question in the back.
It's Julia Cohen from Plastic Pollution Coalition. Nice to see you. I'm excited to read your book, Financing Solutions. Anything you're seeing in solutions to plastic pollution that would not be fossil fuel based, that could be algae, mushroom, mycelium, all of that?
So let me just put in perspective what Julia just said, which is this. We all know, and we're increasingly reading, and she's been way ahead of the curve on this. We're increasingly reading how much plastic pollution there is in the world, how it's probably in every cell of every person sitting in this room right now. We don't exactly know what the health costs of that are to us. We do know it causes severe birth defects. We do know what it does to the oceans, and it's something which is expected. Plastic production is expected to grow multiples between now and 2050. If you talk to the fossil fuel industry, that's their growth, plastics. And it's something which is increasingly something that people are aware has real problems. So, but as you know, we recycle, and we recycle very high percentages of plastics, otherwise known as not true. We recycle 6% of plastics. So all the things you see on TV about how much plastic recycling we do, that's not true. We do 6%. And so to a very large extent, what we've done traditionally is send it to other countries so they can just get rid of it. And we try not to think about what's going on. So there are a whole bunch of things that we've seen, and I don't know I've looked at several technologies on this. I don't know what is going to be the, killer app, so to speak. I do know that this is something which we're behind the curve on. You are ahead of the curve on. This is going to take technology. It's going to take some combination of policy and technology. And it's a perfect example of where they won't impose the policy until the technology is available to make the policy work. And that is really how the government-private sector interaction works. And, you know, if you read about it, it will, in fact, be very disturbing, and it is increasingly disturbing, and it's projected to be multiple, so I don't even know what that means, other than that that can't happen in a way that's safe for us.
Okay, I'd like to thank everyone for coming out tonight. Tom will be signing books in the lobby. And just to thank the JCC for bringing together this conversation. I must say it's really nice to see such a big crowd and an engaged crowd on the topic.
So I do want to, just re-emphasize, this is a great chance for us. Like, one of the things people think is this is a terrible calamity, and it is a huge problem, and it does involve immense human suffering, most of which we don't see in the United States, immense human suffering. It is also a dramatic chance for us to live out what the United States was built to do. It is a great chance for us to come together. It is a great chance for us to build businesses, but it's also a chance for us to succeed together and build something really valuable. And I really think that is the message. The message is not only will we win, but that winning will be wonderful. Passing on it is a gigantic mistake because other people will do it. And this is a thing that we are perfectly prepared to make a major contribution in. And when we look back on our lives and say, what did we do? This is something we can say, this is something we did. This is an important thing that we did. When the chips were down, we did the right thing. That's what I want us to do.